Good afternoon. This is Scott McDonald. I'm the president and CEO of the Advertising Research Foundation, and I would like to invite all of you to participate today and welcome you all to our virtual town hall, How COVID-19 is Affecting Public Attitudes, Emotions, and Values. This is the third in a series of town halls organized by the Advertising Research Foundation, looking at different aspects of the current crisis and how it's affecting our businesses and our lives. Today's town hall really focuses on public opinion survey specialists that have some not only detailed comparative information about the current crisis, having been in field collecting data on public opinion around the globe, but also historical perspective. Every crisis is to some degree unique, but there are similarities that I think can inform some of our expectations about how the current one will proceed and how we will recover from it once it does recede. I would like to remind everyone attending that this is a town hall format where we do encourage your participation and encourage you to join the conversation. At the bottom of the Zoom screen is a Q&A option, and you can type into that with questions that will then be passed on during the discussion phase of today's proceeding. You can also interact with other attendees using the chat located at the bottom of the screen. We've allotted ample time at the end for Q&A and an opportunity to address your questions. So please don't hesitate to submit those using the utility on Zoom. We are also recording today's broadcast, and we will send out a link in a follow-up email sometime tomorrow once we've been able to compile the data from the video and make it available for you to share with your colleagues the information that you get today. So I'm pleased to welcome two speakers today. First up will be Trevor Thompson, who is the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Media Research at the National Opinion Research Center. He is also the Director of the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research. He's a political and social researcher with a specialization in research for public release. He has conducted hundreds of surveys on a wide range of topics, including politics and elections, racial attitudes, healthcare policy, technology, and sports and entertainment, not only in the US, but in dozens of countries. And he'll be followed by Cliff Young. Cliff Young is president of Ipsos Public Affairs in the United States, and he leads Ipsos's global election and political polling practice. He also oversees Ipsos US public opinion polling for Thomson Reuters and is a spokesperson for Ipsos Public Affairs in the US. Cliff is considered an expert on polling in emerging markets, as well as polling in adverse and hostile conditions. So let's get it started with turning the floor over to Trevor.
Thank you very much, Scott. Let me share my screen here. So thank you very much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the research that we've been doing at NORC. I had public affairs and media research at NORC. Since 1941, NORC has been delivering independent, reliable data and rigorous analysis. And NORC also has a partnership with the Associated Press that I lead under the AP NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, and a lot of the research that I'll be showing you today is done in partnership with AP. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our most recent public opinion research looking at the public opinion effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. But then I'm also going to delve a little bit into the rich historical data that NORC has. Because NORC has been studying national crises going all the way back to the Kennedy assassination. And I think there's some things that we can learn from the historical data that will help us understand what's happening now and what might happen as the pandemic evolves in the United States. But first I'll begin with some current polling that we've been doing in the AP NORC Center, and using our AmeriSpeak research platform, which is our main vehicle for conducting public opinion surveys for the AP NORC Center and for lots of other clients at NORC. AmeriSpeak is a probability-based panel. It's designed to be representative of the US population. It's been designed with quality in mind, with a high response rate and recruitment that includes mail, phone, and face-to-face recruitment. It covers the non-internet population with a mixed mode online and telephone design. We have now about 35,000 households on the panel, and is because of our extensive recruitment efforts to recruit panelists to the panel, we achieve a 34% panel recruitment response rate. So it's designed to be a high response rate panel. The surveys that I'm going to talk to you about, the first part have been conducted in February and March. Most recently, March 26th to 29th, we started asking questions about COVID-19 back in February. And you can see for the 3 waves of data that we collected that the public has been getting the message and has concern about the coronavirus has increased rapidly up until the end of March in our most recent data. 50% now said that they are extremely or very worried that they or someone in their family will become infected. That's up from in the low 20s back in mid-February's. Initially, we saw some sort of age differences in concern about the coronavirus. Young people were sort of leading the way in terms of their being sort of early adopters in terms of concern about the virus, but the sort of age differences have tended to subside over time as more people became aware of the threat. As worry increases, so do measures that people are taking on their own to prepare for or prevent the spread of the virus. In response to the outbreak, we see more than 9 in 10 Americans saying they're doing things like washing their hands more frequently, staying away from large groups. And the education is taking hold. We see increases in people saying they're avoiding touching their face, stocking up on extra food, those kinds of behaviors. While there's definitely increased concern about the virus, there are a lot of concerns about the US healthcare system's ability to handle the pandemic. Only about 36% said in our most recent survey that they had quite a bit or a great deal of confidence in US health officials' ability to handle the outbreak, and just 15% felt that hospitals in their area are well prepared to deal with the outbreak. There is widespread support for measures that are being taken to stop the spread from a sort of public health point of view. Upwards of 80% or more favor things like limiting gatherings, closing schools, encouraging people traveling from outside the country to self-quarantine. A little bit less for some of the restrictions around closings, but still support is very high. And in this kind of environment, we rarely see such large levels of consensus of the population and support for certain measures. There are on these still some age differences. Young people are a little less likely to favor requirements that they should have to stay at home or that they shouldn't be able to go to bars and restaurants, but even those numbers among young people are still sort of in the 60%. Those young people who are seen frolicking on the beaches in Florida during spring break really are a minority and not necessarily representative of all American young people. We do see lots of reports of economic impacts from COVID-19, and those are increasing rapidly. There were dramatic shifts in views of the economy, certainly, and how the economy is faring since January. And you can see there, ratings of the national economy really plummeted from January to March in our polling. People's assessments of their household financial situation have been a little slower to change, but we expect that to also sort of catch up given some of the other signs that we're seeing of financial distress in our data. Americans are expressing a lot of concern about the harm that the pandemic may impact on especially small businesses and not-for-profit organizations. A little less worried about the fate of large corporations. As of a most recent survey, about half of adults said that COVID-19 had affected their households' paychecks in some form. We also have at MRC another project called the Mayor Speak Spotlight series that tracks public opinion and sort of quick hit surveys on personal finance and other sort of health topics. And my colleagues on that project collected some data about Americans' purchasing behavior in response to the pandemic, and found a lot of people planning to purchase emergency goods. Perhaps a little bit more on the negative side is that we found over a quarter of Americans expected to go into debt and either finance purchasing of goods with credit cards that they didn't expect to be able to pay off right away, or about 7% of the population said they were actually taking out loans in order to stockpile goods, and those are things that they would not be able to pay off with their current income sources. There's widespread support for potential measures to provide financial assistance to things like hospitals, small business, for increasing unemployment benefits. Things like that. There's far less support among the population, at least as of our most recent survey, for providing funding to industries like airlines and tourism industries. So most Americans approve of how their state and local governments are handling the outbreak, but fewer than half give the federal government strong ratings in their response. And like many things, we do see some dramatic partisan differences in approval, in particular for the federal government's response, with 63% of Republicans approving and only 38% of Democrats, excuse me, only 21% of Democrats approving. Unlike some other data sources that have been in the news, even though we do see some partisan differences in sort of concern about the coronavirus, and like I mentioned, differences in approval of the federal government's response, we haven't seen in our data any evidence that actual personal behaviors, things like self-isolating or some of the other public health kind of behaviors that are recommended, we don't really see any differences between Democrats and Republicans in terms of adoption of those kinds of behaviors. And we've seen in past crises that there was often a sort of rallying effect of the population where the public would put aside their partisan differences and show support for the leadership in a time of crisis. For example, after 9/11, George Bush's approval rating went from in the mid 50s all the way up in some polls to the high 80s after 9/11. We haven't seen that in our data for President Trump so far. President Trump's approval rating in our poll and a lot of others has just been remarkably steady for years. It is, some other polls did see a bounce, and it's possible that just because of the timing of our survey, we might have missed it. But in our survey, we really haven't seen that sort of a rally effect so far in the president's approval ratings in this situation. So I'm going to turn now to some of that historical data that I mentioned, delving into some really rich data sets that NORC has collected over the years. NORC has some of the longest running trends in public opinion. And I think it's true that this pandemic is unlike really anything that we've seen in modern times, and it's not at all clear that the past necessarily is going to tell us what's going to happen in the future. But I do think that there's some things that we've learned from our historical data that could help us understand what's happening and also sort of tell us what we might be in for down the line. One of the richest sources of data that we have in NORC is the General Social Survey, which is really a national treasure. If you're not aware of it, it's funded by the National Science Foundation. It's been conducted since 1972. Except for the US Census data, the General Social Survey is the most frequently analyzed source of information in the social sciences. It typically has a sample size around 2,500 lately, 2,000 to 2,500. But prior to 1994, it was about 1,500 cases. It was last collected in 2018. That was the 32nd round that the survey was fielded. It's NORC's longest running projects, and one of the things that we are most proud of. So drawing some insights from just trends from the GSS, one of the things to note about the environment that this pandemic happens in, it's taking place in an environment where trust in nearly all institutions is at a record low level. The percent of Americans who say they have hardly any confidence in the executive branch hit an all-time high in 2018 of 44%, only 12%. So they have a great deal of confidence in the executive branch of government. It's even a little bit worse in confidence about the Congress. The percent of Americans who say they have a great deal of confidence in Congress has been less than 10% since 2010. So I think the implications of this sort of environment of lack of trust in institutions, and it's not just government institutions, it's lots of other kinds of institutions as well, is I think that misinformation and conspiracy theories can flourish and thrive in this kind of environment where people don't know what information and what sources of information to trust. And I think there's, this is sort of one of the deeply rooted causes of a lot of the hand-wringing that we've been seeing around why some of the misinformation and sort of conspiracy theories that are circulating around the virus and that threaten to undermine the public health response, that this is one of those causes of that sort of behavior. The GSS can also tell us a bit about how long it can take for economic attitudes to recover after a major economic shock. The GSS shows that it can really take a lot longer for individual level feelings of comfort in their personal financial situations to recover. It can take a lot longer than sort of the macroeconomic indicators and the markets do take to recover. So for example, the GSS shows that it took almost 8 years after the start of the Great Recession for people's assessments of their personal financial situations to return to the levels that they had seen before the start of the recession. And in fact, the GSS showed that as of 2018, there were some measures and some populations that still hadn't recovered to pre-recession levels. In particular, as people's views of the employment market still hadn't returned to pre-recession levels as of 2018. The GSS also tells us that for some groups, including African Americans, assessments of their own personal financial situation still hadn't recovered as of 2018. Turning just to some of NRC's data on past national tragedies, NRC has conducted a lot of research around crisis events, but three of the notable ones that I'll also dive into. The first one was done during the Kennedy assassination, 1963. NRC also did a couple rounds of data collection studying Americans in the aftermath of 9/11. And we did a really interesting project after Superstorm Sandy. The Superstorm Sandy project, we conducted two surveys, one several months after the storm that included a national sample as well as an affected area sample. And we did a second wave of data collection almost 2 years after this storm that focused on 12 neighborhoods in New York and New Jersey that were directly impacted by Superstorm Sandy. So there are a few takeaways that I think we can learn from these particular studies. I think the first one is that major crisis events tend to produce emotional and psychological impacts on the population that go well beyond the immediate loss of life and disruption of the economy. And I think these impacts are often overlooked. In all three crises that we studied, we found that the population suffered significant emotional and mental health impacts. In the case of the 12 neighborhoods that we studied that were impacted by Superstorm Sandy, we found levels of emotional stress that were twice the level of national benchmarks. So we're talking about there are large proportions of the populations that were feeling that they often felt nervous, hopeless, sort of feelings that everything was an effort, this sort of emotional distress. And we found that in all three crises that we studied. In the Kennedy assassination and 9/11 attack surveys, we had common items that tracked sort of emotional impacts and mental health impacts. And we found high levels of emotional impacts, not just in the immediately affected areas of, in case of 9/11 of New York, although impacts were higher there, but really the entire country, those crises affected the national psyche in a really significant kind of way. The sort of second takeaway from this, an extension of that, is that these emotional and psychological impacts on the population tend to be long lasting. So our study of the 9/11 attacks showed that for many months after the attacks, the population was reporting higher levels of anxiety, trouble sleeping, feeling tired, especially in New York, but also nationally as well. And our study of Superstorm Sandy neighborhoods showed extremely high levels of emotional stress in impacted neighborhoods that persisted almost 2 years after the storm. So the third major takeaway from those studies is that friends and family are just as critical as governments and first responders in helping communities recover from crisis situations. So a common thread across all of the studies is that friends and family were cited most frequently as the place people turned to for help. People also tended to rate the support they received from friends and family as most effective. This was true of the Kennedy assassination and 9/11 studies, and especially the case of our Superstorm Sandy data. And there, just about everybody in the affected area said that they needed to get some help from someone or someplace. And they said that friends, families, and neighbors were the source of help that they called upon most often. That was true even among the people living in the most severely impacted areas where the official response was the most robust. And that, of course, doesn't mean that sort of official response doesn't have a role, but sort of makes sense in that there's only so much and so many resources that first responders can respond to in a large population area. And so the response really needs to come primarily from the people mobilizing for themselves. And so that's because of that I think it's really worrying that the need to self-isolate in the current crisis might make it much more difficult for people to get the support that they'll need from their friends and family. The fourth major takeaway is that communities that have lower levels of social capital tend to take longer to recover. So by social capital, we refer to the networks of relationships among people who live and work in a particular society. They're the social bonds that allow society to function effectively. When those social relationships are strong, people have an easier time coming together to help each other, to bring restoration to their communities after a crisis. But when those social relationships are weak, we can see antisocial behaviors such as hoarding, looting, vandalism, those kinds of things during crisis events. So in our study of Superstorm Sandy, we showed that neighborhoods where there were higher levels of things like hoarding, looting, vandalism, those communities tended to take longer to recover from the storm. Those neighborhoods were also usually places where people didn't know many of their neighbors and didn't report as many incidences of people helping each other get back on their feet. People living in neighborhoods that were recovering better were significantly more likely to respond to survey questions saying that they thought that most people can be trusted. And they were also sort of less likely to report incidents of sort of antisocial behavior in their neighborhoods. So we found that those social factors really held up even among areas of different economic prosperity. Indeed, we found evidence that the sort of social aspects, the social resources, had more significant impacts on the resilience of neighborhoods with lower levels of socioeconomic status. And our study really sort of fits with other studies of disasters that show similar kind of patterns, such as heat waves. For example, studies of those types of crises showed that neighborhoods where people tended to know each other, had these kinds of social bonds, tend to have fewer deaths because people knew to check in on their neighbors who were vulnerable and offer them assistance. So it might be that if we can offer interventions that can help people cope with their feelings of isolation while still maintaining social distancing, we might indeed be able to reduce the long-term emotional and mental health impacts of the population of the COVID-19 crisis. So doing things like encouraging people to check in on their neighbors and showing people how they can still do that without risking their own safety, that might help a lot in the long run. So just some final conclusions and takeaways. I think we can expect that the psychological and emotional impacts will take a long time to subside, even after the virus comes under control and the economy returns to normal. I think we need to make sure that we do take into account the mental health consequences that the crisis is likely to have on the population. And indeed, we might still be able to take actions that would encourage people to adopt the kind of helping behaviors that might improve the chances that their communities could recover more rapidly. So even just encouraging people to check in on their friends and neighbors, the most vulnerable, to make sure they're okay, might in the long run help communities get it back on their feet faster. The pandemic is obviously still evolving, and NORC is continuing to monitor attitudes, and we're undertaking several projects to sort of deal with and sort of inform the public about the impacts of the disaster. just this morning, we announced a new major data collection initiative that we're in partnership with the Data Foundation. It's a COVID impact survey. It's meant to understand the impacts of the novel coronavirus. The survey will offer policymakers and the public relevant and timely insights about the health, social, and economic impacts associated with the pandemic. It's funded by contributions from philanthropy, including a major gift from the Packard Foundation. So you can get more information on that website there. And with that, thank you very much.
And thank you, Trevor. Very excellent. Thank you for the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Cliff Young from Ipsos. Cliff.
Okay, great to see everyone. Let me get my presentation up. Well, hello everyone. Well, thanks a lot, Scott, and really appreciate being on this town hall, at the ARF's town hall. Obviously, Trevor and I have known each other for years. Great presentation, great data. NRC does great work, and is always tracking the pulse of America. My name's Cliff Young. I'm president of Ipsos Public Affairs. That's the polling and public sector practice at Ipsos. Ipsos is the third largest market and social research firm in the world. We have boots on the ground in 90 countries. We cover 130. And right now we are tracking the pulse of the world when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm going to share today the synthesis of dozens of polls, both here in the United States as well as abroad. I want to give everyone a bird's eye view, our synthetic, holistic view of what's going on. I'm going to overlay over that. I'll talk about past crises, past events. We have a lot of experience, obviously, not just on the economic side, but we work in conflict and natural disaster zones, as well as with past pandemics like Ebola and SARS. I'll sprinkle those experiences in because we're going to be talking about is what we're seeing normal in a situation like this, what should we expect? And especially in Q&A, I think that will come out and we can dive down deep into it. So where do we start? So it'll be 4 basic sections very, very, very quickly. I'm going to give you context, or the context as we see it. We will then talk about behavioral change. Indeed, I don't want to overstate the point here, but we've seen the fastest, most profound, and most pervasive forced behavioral change in American history, and we could even maybe make the argument in global history. Then we're going to talk about politics and government, looking at how the public is thinking about the virus and its governments. And finally, we'll dive a little bit deeper into consumer behavior, consumer confidence, and the pandemic's effect on that. And then obviously we'll open it up, all of us, to Q&A. So first and foremost, what I'm sharing here with you is some snippets from other countries that have gone through this, Italy and China as examples. We actually have a 27 country tracker right now tracking the virus. And I just wanted to show that whether it be at the global level in the United States, we'll take Italy as an example, as a proof point. It's a reference point we've been using. Huge increase in understanding that the virus, the pandemic itself, is a threat to the nation state, is an existential threat. We put China in here because we see this tapering off over time. I'm going to show other data points that is showing the same sort of easing in places like China. Our experience based upon SARS, Ebola, and other sort of pandemics is that there's basically 3 stages. There's the hunker down, huddle down, social isolation stage. There is the beginning to poke your head out into the world stage, whether it be on the economic side or the public sector side. And finally, there is the normality stage. China is in the second stage where it's starting to ratchet down some of the social controls that have been implemented. And we can see that in the data. But the point being is global event, a feel of threat across the board, existential notions of threat in the United States and globally. Then we're looking now at what we call main problems questions. These are priorities. Again, once again, the pandemic is having a profound impact on citizen calculus about the world. Here we're looking at main problems. up to the pandemic. I always said there's a troika in the United States, healthcare on the one hand, jobs in the economy on the other, and finally immigration. Immigration tends to be a Republican issue. Healthcare tends to be a Democratic issue. Jobs and economy somewhere in the middle. And what we've seen is a wholesale restructuring of that right now, where immigration is becoming a less important issue. Really, Americans are not just worried about healthcare, they're worried about their health. Obviously, if you do qualitative or more deep dives on the quantitative side, it's about their health and their family's health, their ability to get healthcare when need be. This sort of restructuring is very rare. These sorts of questions are extremely stable over time, typically from wave to wave. The correlation is very high. So what we're seeing here is profound. It's very analogous to 9/11 when we saw a wholesale restructuring of priorities that went from domestic issues to national security issues, and that stayed during the course of, big chunk of the course of the Bush administration, ultimately. The question is, obviously, will healthcare persist in being the main issue after the virus subsides? We'll have to see. Obviously, jobs and economy is ticking up as people lose their jobs, but a restructuring of the way the citizen voter is seeing the world, and this obviously has impacts on governments and policy. Just to reinforce the point, it's not about economics right now. Americans, we juxtapose the health of society versus the economy. It loses out across the board, whether we're looking at in terms of politics or age groups. People are super focused on the health aspect of the pandemic, less worried in the short term, or at least now, about the economic impact. What we're going to see in a bit is a pretty profound impact on consumer confidence. But right now, it's about health and weathering the pandemic storm, especially from a health perspective. That doesn't mean it's not impacting people individually from an economic perspective, and we'll see that. The last point here before I get into the behavioral change series of data is just that how long do we think this timestamp is? Another data point we have that I didn't include here is something like 55% of Americans believe actually the crisis will last will subside in July or after. So more than a majority of the population believes this thing is going to last for a while. This is just more comparative data. We have June as a timestamp. We'll end by June, and what we can see is in places like the United States and Italy, which are experiencing the unfolding of the pandemic, they're increasingly less optimistic about it ending soon. Obviously in China, less so. China, they're coming out of it. Once again, I talk about those 3 stages of the pandemic experience: the hunkering down, the poking your head out, and ultimately going to normal. China, the expectations are more positive because they've weathered the storm. They're coming out of at least the strong lockdown. But in places like the United States and Italy, and we can just draw the inference, not even the interest, we have the data across all countries in the world that are going through it right now, increasing pessimism about when the pandemic and the social distancing will end. Okay. So that's the broad context. Again, an existential shock to the system, whether it be in the United States or globally. It's profound for those of us who track this stuff, whether it be in the United States or more importantly globally, profound impact on public opinion in general. Where are we right now in the United States? Again, I'll just repeat what I said at the beginning: widespread, unprecedented, widespread, profound, and pervasive forced behavioral change. Never before be seen in American history nor global history. We're going to look at a series of measures that we track in terms of behavioral change. We're at a temporary equilibrium at this point. We've had fast change, and now Americans have kind of leveled off in it and the perceptions of it. It's perhaps the calm before the storm, or this is the new normal. We're not quite sure. The first set of data we're looking at is just looking at personal behavioral change, looking at especially social distancing. We can see that up to this is week over week. This is the last month that we were doing it with one of our media partners, Axios. And what we're seeing basically is continued social distancing with some leveling off. So 10% self-quarantined 4 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, 55% today, 56 went out to eat. 4 weeks ago, only 11% today. So continued social distancing, that's something we're seeing across the board, especially as this rolls out in the non-urban, non-coastal states where this becomes a collective national experience. Ultimately, though, we see this leveling off. I'm going to see this sort of, this stabilization across some of the metrics that I'm going to present in a bit. The next one is looking at the professional side, and just writ large, Americans have either gone virtual or lost their jobs. This was very fast, actually, and indeed, I would make the argument that the jobs reports, the jobs claims are a lagging indicator, that a lot of the negativity, and we're going to see this in the Consumer Confidence Index, it is baked in. I don't know permanently, there might be changes there, but we've seen wholesale sort of shifts. Many Americans going virtual when they're working, just like we are today. We have this virtual town hall going on, people working from home, but many losing their jobs and being furloughed. I would say sort of the central argument here, and I don't have the data point here, but I came out with an article last week on this, is that there's really a tale of two Americas. The more educated, more affluent America is going virtual. They've kind of situated themselves in self-quarantine. The less affluent, the poorer America is basically, they're either losing their jobs, they're being furloughed, they're losing them outright, or they're being forced to work in loco, in physical space. That's the story, and that's kind of a consistent story that we're seeing over time. Again, I don't have the data point here, but the trend is very, very clear. The tale of two Americas, I think Trent's point in citing a lot of the assessments of disasters in the past United States, there's obviously a massive differential impact on communities, those that have the resources, weather the storms, those that don't have problems. And we're seeing the same sort of reorientation during this great adaptation when it comes to social class and needs. The last point is, and Trevor talked about this is looking like the increase in whether your mental health has worsened over the course of time. We saw once again, whether it be mental health or emotional health, quick leap up in between weeks 1 and 2, and then there's kind of a stabilization. This is sort of consistent over time. Once again, we see when it comes to behavioral and emotional change, a quick change, and then leveling off, except for some social distancing. Ultimately, when we look at those who have self-isolated more than those who haven't, those who have self-isolated more tend to feel, more challenges that are mental and emotional well-being. I think, as we all can imagine, in part being cooped up in our place of residence. But once again, wholesale behavioral change across the board. Americans are still social distancing. On the work side, they've made the change. They've either lost their jobs or they're working from home. There's been a worsening of mental health, but an ultimate stabilization. So where are we at? So fine. So that's some context, behavioral change writ large on the personal side, on the work side. Now let's talk about government and politics. What do we see? Where are people going? What are they looking at? This is just looking at wave over wave, credibility of institutions where you go. It's interesting in this highly polarized, highly tribal world where consensus is very difficult to establish in the United States and really in the Western world in general, where the experts have been out, they're on the skids, the populace bash them. It is the experts. The experts are those that we look towards, and we can see that very clearly here. Just looking at sort of levels of trust, Centers for Disease Control, CDC, we can think of Fauci as being the champion of sanity and rationality through this crisis. It reflects itself in the public opinion data. That's where Americans are looking. Obviously, local governments more than for the federal government. Local governments, especially state local governments, are at the forefront. We could think of New York and Governor Cuomo. We could think of the mayor of San Francisco taking stark action, quick action when they needed to impose social distancing. The federal government less so. That's more a reflection of widespread polarization, kind of the polarization effect. Republicans like the government right now, and Democrats don't. Trevor pointed some of that data out. So Americans are looking towards the experts. They're looking towards local governments, especially in this time of need. Americans tend to look at the experts in governments when anarchy is at the door. That's just a very natural sort of human reaction. When it comes to approval ratings, we did see a slight rally around the flag effect, and I'm going to come back to that and talk about the rally around the flag effect and other sorts of effects. Not a huge one. Our trend line over time series over time had Trump around 40%, a little bit above, a little bit below, typically above over the last little bit. By the way, a sitting president that has a 40% approval rating or better has better than a 50-50 chance of winning the next election. That's just not the United States. That's a global average. So it's not a great place, but not such a bad place to be. Mid-40s, he puts them almost into the 90s, 85% or so. So there, even a slight rally around the flag effect has a huge marginal impact on the president's, that is in this case, Trump's ability to win the next election. No one's saying as the events unfold on the ground that this will be the case. Indeed, we saw, as I said before, some slippage. We can really see it when it comes to the president's handling of the outbreak itself. There was this rallying around the flag effect from 38 to 49. That's a big bump, statistically significant bump, important bump. But since then, there's been this sort of ratcheting down or dipping off. And why exactly? Is it the mixed messages that are coming out of the White House? Is it the fact that the virus itself is appearing in other places? Is it because we have a body count that's is impactful to people? Probably a combination of all these. But it does look for now that this sort of rally around the flag effect is waning. And I just want to share this really quickly because we talk about past events. And this is a table that I put together in an article I wrote about a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago, before we really got hit by, full throttle, full-throated sort of, pandemic. And I was asking about the effect of events, of random events on politics. And what we did was we did a meta-analysis of about 50 or 60 studies out there. I mean, indeed, there's an entire literature on the effect of shark attacks on local elections, if you can believe that. But so the point being is, and this is what I emphasize a lot with clients and stakeholders, when we're in the middle of an operating environment like this, we have to understand that past behavior, while important for predicting future behavior, might be attenuated. It might not be as clearly understood. It doesn't mean that past behavior isn't important, but we have to be careful. I often just build scenarios with clients and stakeholders. And so here we just lay out sort of our thinking. Is President Trump more like a wartime president? And we can see, looking at past wars, that you had on average a bump of 16%. Now, these are actual wars. Terrorist attacks have a huge impact as the nation state feels threatened. We saw some of this, obviously. On the flip side, will he be a depression president? Because we're seeing the economic numbers, we're going to see the consumer confidence numbers, and definitely there could be this negative economic impact. So is he one or the other? Is he something in between? I think it's going to be a function of the extent to which Americans blame him for the pandemic on the one hand, the health consequences on the one hand, deaths, for instance, and the economy on the other. We don't know. I think we don't know, and I'm telling everyone, let's keep our eye on approval ratings. Let's play out these two different scenarios. Let's use questions and overlay them to understand how people are reflecting on the presidency. But again, the question is, will he be a wartime president? If he is, he'll probably win the next election. A depression president, he will not. Finally, the last part, and I'm done, and I'll hand it over. It's just let's look at consumer confidence and consumer behavior. We track at Ipsos globally, actually, in 27 countries, monthly consumer confidence. Here I just have the US. We typically do it monthly. We went from a monthly dip to a weekly dip as this thing over the last month unfolded. We saw the largest single decline in our series history, from 60 points to 46 points. That's unprecedented. But like the other data, the behavioral change data, we are seeing a leveling for now. Americans are pausing That doesn't mean it won't dip more as the economy gets worse, if it does get worse, as people have really a lot of difficulties in making ends meet. But ultimately, stark decline, but a leveling off. And it's very important. These indicators are very important for predicting 3 to 6 months out consumer expenditures. Writ large, not necessarily by segment or sector, but very, very good predictors both here in the United States and abroad. Obviously, it's indicative of decreased consumer expenditures. That's a natural coping behavior that humans engage in during times of crisis. They cut out non-essentials. They're less worried about the brand itself. They're more worried about being able to make ends meet and put food on the table. Here, a couple more slides and I'm done. I just wanted to show you that a big chunk of the disruption is happening, obviously, with small businesses as they've laid off people, especially restaurants and other in loco businesses. This comes from our small business survey we do with the American Chamber of Commerce, and we're looking at sort of just once again. I don't want to call it small business Armageddon because it's going to be about the longevity ultimately of the crisis, but major changes. So on the one hand, we have 30% of the businesses have shortened their hours of work. 24% have temporarily closed the business entirely. 17% have adjusted salaries or hours. Wholesale sort of rationing down. And on the business finance side, a vast majority of small businesses are trying to find ways to maintain their cash flow, to be able to pay for things. Obviously, that's key. Obviously, that's why the government has intervened with its stimulus package. Probably will come with another one because obviously, whether it be a big business or a small business, it's all about cash flow. Larger businesses typically have more cash flow to be able to weather the storm. This is the crux for these small businesses right now. Lastly, one slide, then I have a second slide and I'm done. I just wanted to put this into global perspective, the Consumer Confidence Index. The United States has this stark decline, as the Europe does as well. And we're seeing, once again, China coming out of this a bit, not fully, but they're in this second stage now, kind of poking their heads out. Some of the restrictions are going to be lowered, et cetera. Lastly, and then I'm done, this is the last slide. What I wanted to show you is that we are seeing, but we'll especially see in a bit, coping behavior when it comes to the economic downturn. So households are going to reduce their expenditures. They're going to buy less non-essentials. They'll be less brand worried. It'll be about getting the best sort of benefit. That's short-term behavior on the economic side. On event-driven scarcity sort of scenarios where you either have a conflict, a pandemic, or a natural disaster, it's very typical to see. It's very, very typical to see panic buying. Panic buying is momentary. It only lasts as long as the event itself lasts. And I just kind of wanted to kind of point this out because we're seeing this everywhere. Typically, once the event passes, things go back to status quo ante. That's been our experience across the board. SARS was like that. We can probably Q&A talk more in detail about our experience with SARS, Ebola, and others. On the right, we're just looking at a geocoded social media and cell phone data, looking at where we see panic buying. We especially see it in the urban areas. This is something, by the way, we're tracking minute to minute in the United States. And on the left side, just a series of questions, kind of reinforcing the points I was making. There's a lot of scarcity. People are not seeing things there. They're probably more price sensitive at this point as they try to control their household cash flow. That's a typical coping behavior. But across the board, we're seeing lots of scarcity, especially in the urban areas. But this, once again, is something very typical we see in event-driven scarcity scenarios. So with that, I think I'm done. I'll make the general point, which is widespread sense across the globe of an existential threat, wholesale restructuring of what Americans are prioritizing, it's health right now, wholesale and widespread behavioral change. There's been some leveling off, continued social distancing. Trump has lost some of his bluster or his shine. We'll see if he's a depression or a wartime president. consumer confidence has significantly declined. We'll see households adjusting their behavior accordingly. We're seeing panic buying behavior, which is typical in short term, just lasts as long as the crisis. And the last point, which I didn't make, but I'll make here, and I think it has to do with pandemic-driven events. Like Ebola, like SARS and others, is that they're typically coming out of it as an increased sort of social distancing layer. Behaviors can be tweaked a bit. You might wear a mask, you might wash your hands more, you might order more. These are all possibilities and things we've seen in places that were affected by pandemic. So at that, Scott, I'm done with my general briefing. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. And here's the key part where we unshare your screen.
You could do it, go for
it. There we go. All right. So we will now proceed to the discussion and invite Trevor back as well. So thank you both for a very data-rich and provocative sort of summary and account of what we've been seeing. Let me start by sort of pressing a little bit more in asking a bit about the emotional component. This was present in both of your presentations. And I think and Cliff, in your account, this is a bit different when it's an event-driven phenomenon, and particularly where it might provoke some of the kinds of antisocial behaviors that Trevor was referring to as well. In Trevor's account, those had a geographic dimension as well. Were particular neighborhoods that had more evidence of antisocial behavior took a longer time to recover relative to others. And you referenced also urban areas being a bit more prone to this in your data. To both of you, do you think that the recovery coming out of this is likely to be highly varied geographically? Or is it more likely to be something that we see in unison? Because there are various other indicators in your data that show even party differences and age differences subside a lot with regard to particular behaviors, and that people protect themselves and shelter down regardless of their geography or their partisan affiliation, as long as they can do that.
I think I'll go first, I guess. I think that is probably likely to happen. It's just, if only because it seems that the impact of the pandemic is going to differ depending on geography if the sort of current trends sort of continue. But even in the Superstorm Sandy data that we saw, there were significant differences just neighborhood by neighborhood in an urban area. And so it certainly seems likely that we'd see differences between urban and rural areas, but even within rural areas or within urban areas, I think there could be different kinds of impacts. And they would depend on a lot of different variables, including those sort of social cohesion things that I mentioned, but also sort of health system kinds of impacts and economic kinds of differences. I think that's going to be a very rich thing to study if we can get good data on all of this.
Yeah, I would say sort of when we look at our social well-being and mental health measures, there's not huge differences right now by demographics. I think that Americans, there's some, but I think Americans overall are kind of experiencing this in a similar way, maybe in a very abstract way. One of the data points I didn't share was like your sense of existential threat to the country. That's what I showed, which is like super high in the 70s or 80s. And then to what extent do you feel personally threatened? It's still in the 30s. Now that, in a place like Italy, that converges once everyone has experience with it or they're socially proximate to it. We're not still seeing that today. And the United States is a huge place. And so this thing is burning through New York. But most of America isn't New York. So, at that level, I think that not only are we experiencing it differentially today, we will when it's over as well. right? And you can expect certain behaviors in urban areas to be very different than behaviors in rural areas. I would expect that there will be the lasting vestiges of social distancing in one way or another. Wearing masks, maybe washing your hands more frequently, being leery or wary when you go into a crowded place, especially in urban areas. You probably won't have the same imprint in more rural or non-urban areas. That's just a hypothesis, but I think that's reasonable based upon what we've seen in the past. And independent of our own polling data, I agree with Trevor. When it comes to crises, there's a differential effect on neighborhoods and communities. Those that have greater social capital, higher levels of education and income tend to weather those events more. In addition, if you look at sort of levels of stress related to violence and poverty, those are starting points. And they're differential across communities. So you already have communities that are highly traumatized, whether it be because of violence, poverty, or probably a combination of the two. Events like this have an interactive, added effect on these communities. I've seen this in my own work in places like Sao Paulo, Brazil, even after Katrina in New Orleans. And so independent of the polling and just thinking of the social science in general, we would expect there to be some sort of differential impact given the organization of the given neighborhoods. That said, poor America, less affluent America is going about their business because, by the way, they have to make ends meet. And more affluent, more educated America, we're huddled in a virtual way. We're having this meeting. And so, life still goes on, right?
It's one of the paradoxes of this particular situation. In the past rallies, where people will respond to a crisis by coming together in communities, showing some solidarity, getting comfort from friend and family networks, is counterindicated when you're supposed to be socially distancing. And so it's one of the paradoxes. I would expect that some of the focus on sanitary, on everything needing to be sanitary, hand washing, and things of that sort will persist for quite a while. By the way,
I never used to do that, Scott, and I'm doing it. So there's gonna be a lot of these sorts of people.
As is everyone, and coincidentally, the data I've been seeing on flu infection is actually, this is a pretty light flu year. Because there's a lot more hand washing. So, but it leads me to another question, really, about what the longer term impact might be, and it goes back to the General Social Survey, which has been used a lot historically to study what causes people to be happy. And if I were to summarize the results of a whole lot of studies that I've seen on happiness and social correlates of happiness, it's basically that it's not money. You're as apt to find unhappy rich people as unhappy poor people. Some people have been able to calculate it by sort of relative measures versus peer as maybe being more important. But the most consistent correlate is health. So at a period of time where people are very anxious about their own health or their family's health, that would lead to this sort of extra level of emotional distress around the current crisis that transcends economic issues and things of that sort. That said, a lot of jobless claims filed every week now, over 6 million in the last 2 weeks. And your lagging indicator of consumer confidence, which drives a whole lot of the consumer markets and advertising markets. So how would you think about that balance between health and preoccupation with health as maybe the thing that might, when it finally the coast clears and everybody breathes a sigh of relief and might be safe to poke your head out of the hole and everyone's happy because the health threat has diminished, but our economy is in shambles. I mean, how should we think about those two together?
Trevor, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, that's obviously the huge challenge that the society is facing right now, because the economic impact is enormous, and the long-term impacts of that could be very severe. But there's also the immediate health concerns. So far, the public is showing a lot of support behind the health measures that are being taken, and we see just widespread level of support, including for those things that are having a lot of economic kind of impacts. But as this goes on, I wouldn't be surprised if there starts to be some shift in those measures, and people start to express more anxiety about the economics and start to face that sort of dilemma, every person on their own. And I wouldn't be surprised to see opinion shift on that. Cliff?
Yeah, on the economic side, I think that we can understand. Well, once again, it's going to be a function of how long we're self-quarantining and we're isolating, right? And so, if it's a month, it's one thing. If it's 6 months, it's quite another in terms of the economy. But that said, if you take SARS as an example, and take Hong Kong, once the crisis subsided, the economy jumped back fairly quickly. Now, it was differential across sectors, and so had a sectoral effect. But there is this sort of, you get back to normalcy or a new normal, whatever you want to call it, fairly quickly. Let's say the timestamp could be from 3 to the 6 months after things have kind of cleared, depending on the sector. I think really what we're seeing is this sort of short-term adjustments so households can maintain themselves. And it's going to be a function of how long the pandemic is ingrained in the way we actually organize ourselves in general. I think the bigger question is going to be on the health side. Listen, there is a difference between this happening in the United States of America and Europe versus an emerging market. And this is based upon my own experience. There's a risk tolerance in places that just have a lot of stuff that goes wrong. So I lived in Brazil and Latin America for 10 years, pulled and worked all over sub-Saharan Africa. There's a risk tolerance for these sorts of things that we don't have here in the United States or Europe. And I think that this will shatter our sense of civilization to some extent. Now, whether that's permanent or not, that's obviously a different question. But I do think we're going to see these, a series of coping behaviors that will persist into the near term to protect ourselves from a health perspective. Lots of different sort of micro decisions at the household level to further that. And I think that in the industrialized world, our sense of basically our sense of invincibility will be shattered, or is shattered now. It shouldn't happen in places like this, but it is. And it will probably take longer for us to sort of get back to normal than a place that goes through these sorts of crises and uncertainties, and where people have already baked into their calculus a little bit of randomness to their lives.
So a number of the questions that have come in through the app here are really about what that new normal would look like. And you've given, I think, a partial answer there, Cliff, of your view that even if a lot of other behaviors return, that probably health behaviors will sustain, and maybe, and I guess it was Trevor's data that showed that some attitudes and behaviors post 9/11 lasted for nearly a decade. Do either of you have other views as to other things that might define what the new normal would look like, and how it might be different from what we thought of as normal prior to this?
Do you want me to go first, Trevor?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just, I'm taking a jump off the cliff, Scott. So if everyone's recording me, hopefully you don't make this snippet and put it out there in a year to show that I'm wrong. I do think on the health and the social distancing side, we're going to have a permanent imprint on the way we do things. We're going to see governments organize themselves in a different way to meet these sorts of things. Indeed, one of the reasons I believe that it didn't have the same impact in Asia is because the Asian countries had gone through this already, right? And I do think that's going to be permanent. I don't know exactly what that means. Obviously, from a health maintenance and protection standpoint, more people will wear masks. They'll stay away from crowded places. They'll be washing their hands more. They might buy online more. They might ask for delivery more. We don't know, but like some sort of, let's call it portfolio of solutions will be there that weren't there before, and people will consciously and deductively choose them to cope with what they've gone through. Everything else, I think, goes back to normal. I really think so. I think that it will change us on that dimension, but like so many of the crises, it might have a differential impact here and there with certain groups, but I do think we get back to normal across the board on most other dimensions, and that's at least in a very prescribed way what we've seen with Ebola and SARS. Maybe we can't use those as reference points, but let's use them. So I think for the most part, we get back to normal, but the social distancing and health side there'll be a permanent imprint on the way we behave.
Trevor, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's speculation, which I've been trained, especially at university. We don't like to speculate. We like to have data, but I think one of the things that would be interesting to watch is how this sort of plays out in terms of the election campaign and the focus on issues. We already saw that healthcare was a dominant issue in the election, and I think Cliff's data showed those sort of shifts as well in terms of economy versus health. But I think what also may happen is that the debate around healthcare may shift as well into not just how to pay for it, but what the health system of the country should be. So some of those issues that a lot of people have been warning about, not just in terms of pandemics, but in terms of the aging population and whether the healthcare system and the social services system is prepared to deal with the aging population, may become more of a dominant kind of issue in the near term because of the pandemic. But that remains to be seen, just speculation.
Can I add to this? Can I add to that?
Sure.
Just can I riff off of what Trevor's saying? I absolutely think that will be about health. And whether it be the debate in this electoral cycle or in future ones in the near term, I think it's like, once again, it's there. It's good. It's imprinted. But I don't know what it will be about. I don't know if we're going to be discussing the same big government, small government solutions. I think that's, I think there's a huge question mark there. We might be talking about public health and how we implement, how we teach our kids in school proper sort of protocols and procedures that make themselves safe, how we, work in our neighborhoods and with our local governments to do a better job than we did now. I think the debate, obviously the traditional big government, small government, nationalized healthcare versus sort of private health will be there because that's who we are as a nation. But I think we're going to be talking about a lot of things that we never talked about before.
Okay, good. We have some questions that are perhaps a bit less speculative and more about the data. And one of them actually has to do with gender, which was not a demographic that showed up in anyone's slides. Are there gender differences in your data in the response to to COVID-19?
Gender was not something that we saw a lot of major differences in our data. I know, Cliff, did you?
No, we don't see huge differences. I mean, I can't remember offhand. I mean, I'm sure sort of when it comes to Trump, I mean, we know that, women don't like Trump as much as men, but that's just sort of something that's always been there baked in. And no, so we don't see, massive, huge differences. Again, I mean, we don't always look at that demographic. That hasn't been one we focused on. I think it's a great question, but for the most part, what I've seen, we haven't seen big differences.
Okay. There are a number of questions really about the practice of research at this moment, which all of you are very much engaged with. And I mean, some of them are questions about whether any face-to-face interviewing is taking place, how you've adapted your data collection techniques. And some of them are questions, again, about where you think, that might lead to in public opinion polling and changes in methods going forward. So sort of how is it now and how do you think it'll be in the future kind of question.
Want me to go first, Trevor? You want to go? I'll go. Yeah. Okay. So, first and foremost, the health of our employees and respondents is most important. Obviously, face-to-face is basically, we can't do it in a traditional form. A lot of what we transferred to online formats. We have a panel called the Knowledge Panel, which is very analogous to what NRC has. We have other sorts of panels, online panels. We're doing lots of online research. When it comes to Katie or phone interviewing, we went from doing it in loco in facilities to at home when interviews are at home. So we social distanced. We applied sort of that method when thinking about our business. But it's important to emphasize we're doing the same number of interviews before COVID as today. The same case in Italy and China. So we're still tracking the pulse of America and the world. We've just gone more virtual, like many Americans have gone virtual, and use other sorts of coping mechanisms, interviewing from home if it's by phone, to be able to properly social distance and keep people safe.
Yeah, it's very much the same for NORC. We still do a lot of face-to-face research for a lot of our government projects and other big projects, and that face-to-face interviewing is just not possible in the current environment in the US. So we've been transitioning that as much as possible to telephone and online. We've had to shut down our call centers and move interviewing to work from home as much as we possibly can, but that's been a challenge as well. Our AmeriSpeak panel, though, is up and running, and it's extremely busy and very much in demand right now because of a lot of the problems doing research is in other modes. I think it's also the qualitative work that we do. We've had to transition that to online as well, and Zoom and sort of virtual focus groups. And I wouldn't be surprised if that sort of work winds up sort of sticking that way, that increasingly more and more clients go to virtual data collection and interviewing for qualitative work in particular. So.
And in a related vein, from one of the members of the audience who writes, as a market researcher, I'm having a hard time keeping up with the pace of the changing landscape. We can field a study on Monday, get results on Wednesday, and by Friday, everything in the world has changed and the 2-day-old data already feels stale. How do we address this as researchers?
You go to the field again, I guess, if you can. Yeah, it's a tricky thing. And so one of the things, a lot of the way we've readjusted things is giving our clients and stakeholders, going from super strategic, research to very tactical research, right? Like making decisions within the week, within the day, but, and adjusting sort of the, decision makers going to use data slightly differently. And that's been our experience across the board. They're making more tactical short-term decisions. There's some strategic planning, but it's very hard in sort of this new operating environment, which we don't know how long it will be around. But, just to emphasize a point, the data itself that I show, I think that Trevor did as well, that we were showing here, suggests there's been an abatement or there's been a leveling off. And so, whereas, Americans, humans, whatever you want to call them, respondents, we're in a flux, we're in the tizzy, we're confused like all of us 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, there is some sort of normality now. And we have to understand that, I think that, response will be more able to sort of respond than they were even a few weeks ago. So it's not changing every second. I think that's the point I'm making.
Yeah,
a number of your,
yeah.
I mean, a number of the slides that you showed a big change at the beginning, a month ago, and then some stabilization.
Yeah, because that's where we are. This is like I wouldn't call it the new normal, but America's taking a collective pause. They've adjusted themselves. Now the facts on the ground might change things again. But we're not consistently or constantly changing every day, every week. We have hit some sort of stability, and we'll see if this might be a temporary equilibrium or not, right?
Right. A question about the data showing increased trust in experts. and with trust levels that are significantly higher than the long-term trends that Trevor shared on confidence in the executive and confidence in the Congress, which have pulled quite low for a long time. Of course, it's a slightly different question there, but there did not appear to be much of a difference in level of trust in different media channels, newspapers, cable television, online, social media. Those seem to be relatively unaffected across the time trend, whereas specifically mentioned experts saw a sea change in their kind of level of acceptability. How should we think about that? Is the media a trust question more baked into our political polarization and thus less sensitive to these other perturbations, or is there another explanation for why we would be seeing those patterns?
Let me go try. I'll take a crack at it. Yeah, on the media side, it's all baked into our political calculus, and so we evaluate many Americans, not all Americans, but evaluate the media outlets by their political persuasion, and they'll have a positive or negative opinion of them. Obviously, more traditional media, whether it be cable, newspapers, is more trusted than, let's say, social media. Social media obviously is a very fractured environment and has differential impacts. People believe some things and not other things. But when it comes to experts are back in, right? And Fauci he's a superstar right now, right? He is the single most credible American, I would, today, and maybe in the last 10 years or so, right? And scientists, science, medicine never lost their shine. When you look at the general social survey over time, they always kind of held their own at a higher level relative to political institutions like the federal government and Congress. And then we're in this strange situation. So you have this situational effect where, Americans, humans are searching for certainty, searching for safety, and obviously it's going to be the experts when it comes to health. And so that would be my 2 cents. Media outlets, the political calculus is already baked in there. Scientists have always rated higher over time, but we have this situational effect where people are looking for certainty, groping for something to tell them, how they should organize their lives.
Yeah, I wish I had more current data on that, but at NRC, we've done a lot of research on what causes people to trust different news sources. We have a whole project around called the Media Insight Project that tries to understand issues like that. And it's just true from that research that there's just really 2 worlds in terms of Republicans versus Democrats in terms of what media sources they trust or whether the extent they trust the media at all. Be interesting to see how that plays out. Also, just in terms of news on social media, our research shows that people rely a lot on their social networks and tend to trust news that's shared by people that in turn they trust more than the actual sort of news sources that they originate from. So it'll be interesting to see whether that sort of holds up or changes in terms of sort of expert kind of health-related kind of information. We used sort of health frames in our research before and still found this sort of effective, we shared it kinds of matters, but it will be interesting to see whether that changes. And I wish I had data on that, and maybe we will.
Yeah, a question on that, Trevor. I noticed that your GSS data only went through 2018. So are there plans for future waves of the General Social Survey? And if one of those were to be scheduled in the middle of a moment like this, would there be a temptation to pause it until a more normal time, or how would that be thought of?
Yeah, that is a challenge. This is one of the years where we would conduct the GSS, and I know my colleagues who work on the GSS are spending a lot of time trying to unpack that big problem right now. So I won't, I honestly don't know what their solution is right now, but I know that they're working really hard on making sure that the GSS continues, because it really is a national treasure. And
I mean, it also happens to hit in the middle of the census.
yes, yeah.
So yeah, it's a complex. A question on whether the virus, whether you either of you think that the virus will have a direct effect on who one votes for in the election in November.
That's an awesome question. And this is something we're thinking about a lot, but we don't know. So the question is, would there be some sort of different, well, there could be two sort of effects, right? The macabre effect is that it has a differential impact in terms of mortality rate on older people who typically go out and vote more, and they typically vote more Republican. And so could that be, could the mortality rates be large enough in those key 3 swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, to turn the tide? I mean, that's, yeah, probably not, obviously. We're not talking about millions of people. We're talking about, tens of thousands perhaps. But could it have a fear impact? Whether that be older people that really are worried about their health and they want to social distance, and they're less likely to show up. There could be that effect. There can also be the effect of states taking certain actions. We saw this in Wisconsin, that in the city of Milwaukee, there are only 5 open polling booths or something around that versus the dozens and about 100 they have typically. So it's really hard to say which way this will go. We could see certain states that will be more restrictive and use this to restrict access to vote. You can see on the flip side, people being more scared to go out. Where those restricting a vote typically hurts the Democrats. If older people are scared to go out, they have some sort of fear, that could have an effect on Republicans. Ultimately, we don't know, and it's something we're just going to have to track over time. But we do have different working hypotheses or theses, as I just laid out.
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying for a long time that I think the deciding factor in the elections will be turnout. I just think that for the most part, people have, just given the highly polarized kind of environment, people have mostly made up their minds about who they're supporting. I know our data on Trump's approval rating, the fact that it hasn't budged in all of this, if that continues to be the case, then I do think those turnout factors will continue to be the most critical. And it could really be a dicey situation if, as some experts say might happen, there might be a second wave of the virus hit in the fall, and states will be dealing with the kind of situation that some of these late primary states are dealing with now, about how they're going to hold a general election in the midst of a pandemic. And I think that can have a really major effect on election results and turnout.
Great, great. Well, we're almost out of time, so I think this will be the last question. A number of questions, of course, have had to do with what the recovery would look like, and we've talked about it to some extent. But the question of whether this, the economic recovery might be a V-shaped, quick bounce back, or a U-shaped, more gradual bounce back, or L-shaped, where it doesn't bounce back very much. It could be, much more like the financial crisis of 2008, which took, 7, 8 years to unwind. Obviously, from your data, it looks like the public expects we're still going to be, the majority of the public still thinks we're going to be at some level hunkered down in June, or at least for a while. And so that's an expectation. What indicators would you be looking for in trying to assess whether it's V or U or L-shaped recovery?
It's your turn, Trevor.
Well, I'm not an economist, so I can't speak.
But you play one on TV.
Yeah, I can't speak to the economic kind of issues. For me, I'll be watching the economic attitudes and the confidence. And For me, it's not so much the sort of macro level consumer confidence and people's perceptions of the economy. Those are important politically, I think, but I've been looking at those individual level experience kinds of measures and how people feel about their own personal financial situations. And I expect that those will not move in lockstep, that some people will take a lot longer to get more comfortable with their finances than other people. And that's what I'll be watching.
Good.
Yeah,
Cliff, we're pretty much out of time, but quickly, what do you think?
I think we need to look at government. I think the first indicator is what government at the federal level and state and local levels, what they do. To what extent do they roll this back? They're not going to roll it back 100%. It's going to be staged. Those stages will have differential impact, especially on small businesses, where people can go back to restaurants and work there, at bars, etc. And then, once we see that rollout, and that's gonna, whatever the timestamp is a timestamp. We don't know. I think that will probably, whatever, it'll look more like a U. I don't think we get to status quo ante like where we were before this in January. I think there's going to be a lingering effect of this pandemic. Whether that affects 5% or 10% of our behaviors, I'm not quite sure, but definitely will affect us on the health dimension, as already mentioned. So I would look towards the government especially and see how they roll this out, because they'll have a huge impact on how the recovery behaves.
Great. Well, I thank you. I thank both of you for joining us at the town hall. I thank the audience for participating and asking questions. Remember that the broadcast itself will be available tomorrow, and we will send a link out to everyone who was registered. We also will ask you to take a brief survey on how you found this today, and do keep an eye out for future town halls. We're doing them with considerable frequency right now. Seems like a very good time to be doing this. So I thank you all and wish you a good afternoon.